The wind carried the sound through the pines like a wounded animal, soft and broken, rising and falling with no particular rhythm. Jack Mercer heard it as he rode through the dense thicket of lodgepole pines that stretched endlessly across the Montana Territory. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks, the way it does when a man has been alone too long with nothing but his horse and his thoughts. But Thunder, his dappled mare, heard it too. Her ears pricked forward, and she slowed without him pulling the reins. Jack had been riding for 3 days straight, following a trail that had long gone cold. He was tracking a man who had stolen cattle from the ranch where he worked, but the tracks had disappeared into the forest 2 days back, and Jack knew in his gut that he was chasing ghosts now. He should have turned back yesterday, but something kept him moving forward. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the fact that going back meant admitting failure to Old Man Henderson, who had taken a chance on him when no one else would. The sound came again, clearer this time. It was crying. A child's crying. Jack dismounted and tied Thunder to a low branch, then moved quietly through the underbrush. The forest floor was thick with pine needles that muffled his footsteps. He had learned to move quietly during the war, back when silence meant the difference between living and dying. That was 15 years ago now, but a man never forgets lessons learned in blood. He found her in a small clearing where the afternoon sun broke through the canopy in golden shafts. She was maybe 6 years old, 7 at most, with tangled brown hair that hung past her shoulders and a dress that had once been blue, but was now torn and stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood. She sat with her back against a fallen log, her knees drawn up to her chest, sobbing into her arms with the kind of desperation that only comes from true hopelessness. Jack stopped at the edge of the clearing and cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle her. The girl's head snapped up, and he saw her face for the first time. Her cheeks were streaked with tears and dirt, her eyes red and swollen from crying. But it was the terror in those eyes that struck him hardest. She looked at him like he was death itself come to collect her. "Easy there, little one," Jack said, keeping his voice low and gentle. "I'm not going to hurt you. I heard you crying. What are you doing out here all alone?" The girl didn't answer. She pressed herself harder against the log, as if she could somehow disappear into it. Jack crouched down to make himself less imposing. He was a big man, 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and hands roughened by years of hard work. He knew he could be frightening to a child, especially one who was already scared out of her wits. "My name is Jack. What's yours?" Still no answer. The girl just stared at him with those wide, terrified eyes. "Are you lost?" Jack asked. "Where are your folks?" At that, something broke in the girl's face. Her lips trembled, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Mama," she whispered. "I want my mama." Jack felt something twist in his chest. "Where is your mama?" "Sweetheart," she wouldn't wake up. The girl said, her voice barely audible. I tried to wake her, but she wouldn't open her eyes. There was so much blood. Jack closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. He had seen enough death in his life to know exactly what the girl was describing. "Where is she?" he asked gently. "Your mama, where is she?" The girl pointed vaguely behind her, deeper into the forest. "Will you show me?" Jack asked. The girl shook her head violently. "I can't go back there. The bad men might come back." Jack's jaw tightened. "Bad men. They came to our wagon. Papa tried to stop them, but they shot him. Then they hurt Mama." The girl's voice broke completely and she dissolved into tears again. Jack stood up slowly, his mind racing. Bandits or outlaws? Most likely. They would have attacked a wagon on one of the trails, killed the father, done who knows what to the mother, and probably never even saw the little girl, who must have hidden or run. How long had she been out here? A day. 2. He knelt down again and spoke in the calmest voice he could manage. "Listen to me. I know you're scared. I know you want your mama. But we need to get you somewhere safe. There's a town about 20 miles from here. I can take you there. There are good people there who will help you. I want my mama," the girl sobbed. "I know, honey. I know you do." Jack paused, trying to find the right words. "Your mama would want you to be safe. She would want you to be somewhere warm, with food and clean clothes and people who can take care of you. Can you be brave for her? Can you come with me?" The girl looked at him for a long moment, her small chest heaving with ragged breaths. Finally, she nodded, just barely. Jack held out his hand. "Come on then. Let's get you on my horse." She took his hand, her small fingers cold and trembling in his palm. She was lighter than he expected when he picked her up. All bones and fear. He carried her back to where Thunder waited, and the horse, bless her steady heart, stood perfectly still as he lifted the girl into the saddle. "What's your name, little one?" Jack asked as he untied Thunder's reins. "Sarah," the girl whispered. "Well, Sarah, you hold on tight now. We have a long ride ahead of us." Jack climbed up behind her, and she immediately grabbed onto the saddle horn with both hands. He wrapped one arm around her to steady her and took the reins with the other. As they started moving, he felt her small body shaking with silent sobs. The ride to Cottonwood Creek took them through the night. Jack pushed Thunder harder than he normally would, but he needed to get Sarah somewhere safe. The girl fell asleep against him after the first few hours, exhausted from fear and grief. He held her carefully, making sure she wouldn't fall, and listened to her breathing. Every now and then she would whimper in her sleep, and he would murmur something soothing, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. As he rode, Jack thought about the girl's parents lying dead somewhere in those woods. He thought about the men who had killed them. His jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He had seen too much senseless violence in his life. During the war, at least there had been reasons, however misguided. But this, killing innocent people, leaving a child orphaned and alone, there was no reason for that. There was no excuse. He also thought about what would happen to Sarah when they reached town. There was an orphanage in Cottonwood Creek, run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson. Jack had met her a few times. She was a good woman, stern but kind, and she took care of the children who had nowhere else to go. Sarah would be safe there. She would have food and shelter and other children to play with. But Jack knew, with a heaviness that settled in his bones, that safe wasn't the same as happy. This little girl had just lost everything. No amount of shelter or food could fix that. They reached Cottonwood Creek just as the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was a small town, just one main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a handful of other buildings. The orphanage was at the far end of town, a 2-story wooden structure that had been painted white but was now faded and peeling in places. Jack dismounted and gently lifted Sarah down. She was awake now, looking around with confused, sleepy eyes. He took her hand and led her up the steps to the front door, then knocked firmly. It took a few minutes, but eventually the door opened to reveal Mrs. Patterson. She was in her 50s, gray-haired and thin, with wire-rimmed spectacles perched on her nose. Her expression was stern until she saw Sarah, and then it softened immediately. "Mercy," she breathed. "Jack Mercer, what have you brought me?" "Found her in the forest," Jack said quietly. "Her parents were killed by bandits. She's been alone out there for at least a day, maybe more." Patterson's eyes filled with sorrow. She crouched down in front of Sarah and spoke gently. "Oh, you poor dear. Come inside. Let's get you cleaned up and fed." Sarah looked up at Jack with panic in her eyes. "Don't leave me," she whispered. Jack felt that twist in his chest again, sharper this time. He knelt down beside her. "I'm not leaving you, Sarah. I'll stay until you're settled, okay? I promise." Patterson led them inside to a large kitchen where the smell of porridge and fresh bread filled the air. Several other children were already eating breakfast, ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers. They all looked up with curiosity as Sarah entered Mrs. Patterson heated water for a bath and found clean clothes that were a little too big but would do for now. Jack sat in the kitchen and waited while she helped Sarah wash away the dirt and tears and blood. When the girl emerged, her hair was brushed and braided, and she looked almost like a normal child, except for the haunted look in her eyes. Sarah ate slowly, mechanically, barely seeming to taste the food. She kept glancing at Jack as if to make sure he was still there. He stayed at the table with her, drinking the coffee Mrs. Patterson offered and trying to figure out what to do next. After breakfast, Mrs. Patterson showed Sarah to a room upstairs where she would sleep. There were 4 beds in the room, and 2 other girls were already there, playing with corn husk dolls. They greeted Sarah shyly, but she didn't respond. She just sat on the bed Mrs. Patterson indicated and stared at her hands. Jack stood in the doorway, feeling more helpless than he had in years. He had faced down armed men without flinching. He had survived battles where death rained from the sky. But he had no idea how to help this little girl who had lost everything. Mrs. Patterson touched his arm and gestured for him to follow her downstairs. In the kitchen, she poured them both more coffee and sat across from him at the table. "She'll need time," Mrs. Patterson said. "Time and patience and love. I've seen children come through here who have lost their families before. Some recover quickly. Others carry the wound for the rest of their lives. But they all survive one way or another. What will happen to her? Jack asked. She'll stay here until we can find her a family to take her in. Sometimes relatives come forward. Sometimes a family in town decides to adopt. Sometimes, she paused and looked at him meaningfully. Sometimes someone unexpected steps up. Jack shook his head. I'm a ranch hand, ma'am. I live in a bunkhouse with 6 other men. I don't have a home to offer a child. I wasn't suggesting you take her in, Mrs. Patterson said, though her tone suggested that maybe she had been thinking exactly that. I'm just saying that sometimes life puts people in our path for a reason. You saved that little girl's life, Jack. That counts for something. Jack drank his coffee and said nothing. After a while, he stood up. I should get back to the ranch. Henderson will be wondering where I am. Will you come visit her? Mrs. Patterson asked. I think it would help her to see a familiar face. Jack hesitated. He knew the smart thing was to make a clean break, to let Sarah settle into her new life without him. But then he remembered the way she had looked at him when Mrs. Patterson tried to take her inside, the panic in her eyes when she thought he was leaving. He remembered holding her on the horse all night, feeling her small body shake with silent sobs. Yeah, he said finally, I'll come visit. True to his word, Jack rode into Cottonwood Creek the following Saturday. He brought a small bag of peppermint candies from the general store, feeling foolish as he knocked on the orphanage door. What did he know about what little girls liked? Sarah's face lit up when she saw him. It was the first smile he had seen from her, tentative and small but real. She took the candies with a whispered thank you and led him to the sitting room where some of the other children were playing. They sat together on a worn sofa, and Jack found himself telling her stories about thunder and the ranch in the mountains. Sarah listened quietly, occasionally asking a question in her soft voice. She didn't mention her parents and Jack didn't bring them up. For an hour, they existed in a small bubble where there was no grief, no loss, just a man and a girl sharing stories. Jack started coming every Saturday after that. Sometimes he brought candy, sometimes a ribbon for Sarah's hair. Once a small wooden horse he had carved himself. Sarah began to open up a little more each visit, telling him about the other children and Mrs. Patterson and the lessons she was learning. The haunted look in her eyes began to fade, slowly replaced by something that might eventually become hope. Other children at the orphanage began to look forward to his visits too. He would tell them stories or help them with their chores or, once, organized a game of tag in the yard that left everyone breathless with laughter. Mrs. Patterson watched these interactions with approval and something else in her eyes that Jack couldn't quite name. 3 months after he found Sarah in the forest, Jack was working in the barn at Henderson's ranch when the old man came to find him. Henderson was in his 60s, with a weathered face and a lifetime of hard work carved into his bones. He had been a good employer, fair and honest, and Jack respected him. Need to talk to you. Jack, Henderson said, leaning against a stall door. Jack set down the saddle he had been oiling. Yes, sir. I'm selling the ranch. The words hung in the air like smoke. Jack felt his stomach drop. Sir, my daughter in California has been after me to come live with her. Her husband has a business there, and they've got room for me. I'm getting too old for this life, Jack. My joints ache every morning, and last winter nearly killed me, Henderson sighed. I'm sorry. I know this puts you in a tough spot. Jack nodded slowly. He had no savings to speak of. He had been sending a portion of his wages to his sister back east, helping her raise her kids after her husband died. The rest went to necessities. He had nothing put aside for a situation like this. When? He asked. Art of the month. Buyer wants to bring in his own crew. Henderson looked genuinely sorry. You're a good worker, Jack. Best hand I've ever had. You'll find another position easy enough. But Jack wasn't so sure about that. Work was scarce in these parts, and most ranches already had full crews. He might have to travel to find work, maybe all the way to Wyoming or Colorado. The thought of leaving Cottonwood Creek, of leaving Sarah, felt like a stone in his chest. That Saturday, Jack sat with Sarah in the orphanage sitting room and tried to figure out how to tell her he might be leaving. Sarah was showing him a drawing she had made of a horse that looked suspiciously like Thunder, chattering more freely than she ever had before. She had finally started to feel safe, to feel like maybe the world wasn't such a terrible place after all. He couldn't find the words, so he said nothing, just listened to her talk and tried to memorize the sound of her voice. That night, lying in his bunk, while the other ranch hands snored around him, Jack stared at the ceiling and thought about his life. He was 42 years old. He had fought in a war, drifted from job to job, never staying in one place long enough to call it home. He had no wife, no children. Nothing to show for all his years except scars and caluses and a mare who had been with him for 8 years. He had been content with that, or at least he had told himself he was content. But now, thinking about Sarah and the way she looked at him like he mattered, like he was someone worth waiting for, he realized how empty his life had been. The next morning, Jack rode into town early. He found Mrs. Patterson in the orphanage kitchen, preparing breakfast. "I need to ask you something," he said without preamble. "If a man wanted to take in one of the children here, what would he need? What would the requirements be?" Mrs. Patterson set down her mixing spoon and studied him carefully. He would need a home, stable income. He would need to prove he could provide for a child's needs, food, clothing, education, and he would need to be of good moral character. She paused. "Are we talking about Sarah?" "Yes, ma'am." "Can you provide those things?" "Jack, not right now," he admitted. "The ranch is being sold. I'll be out of work in 3 weeks. But I'm good with my hands. I could build a house, start my own place. There's government land available for homesteading up in the Northern Territories. I could file a claim, build a cabin, start small. I'm not afraid of hard work." Mrs. Patterson smiled. "No, I don't imagine you are." She poured him a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, gesturing for him to join her. "Jack, do you understand what you're proposing? Raising a child alone is one of the hardest things a person can do. Sarah has been through terrible trauma. She will need patience and understanding and love. There will be hard days. Days when she has nightmares or pushes you away or breaks down crying for no reason you can understand. Are you prepared for that?" Jack thought about Sarah crying alone in the forest. He thought about holding her on the horse all through the night. He thought about the way she smiled when she saw him on Saturdays, the way she was slowly learning to trust again. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'm prepared." "Why?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Why do you want to do this?" Jack was quiet for a long moment. "When I found her in those woods, she looked at me like I was her last hope. And when I left her here that first day, she looked at me like I was abandoning her. I can't get those looks out of my head." He rubbed his face. "I've spent my whole life drifting, Mrs. Patterson, never had a reason to put down roots. But that little girl needs someone. And maybe I need her too. Maybe I need a reason to build something that lasts." Mrs. Patterson reached across the table and patted his hand. "Then you'd better get started building that house." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Jack filed a homestead claim on 160 acres of land about 5 miles from Cottonwood Creek. It was rough country, dense with trees and crossed by a cold stream. But the soil was good and there was plenty of water. He spent every spare moment clearing a space for a cabin, using his last wages to buy lumber and supplies. The other ranch hands thought he was crazy. "You're going to break your back trying to farm that land alone," one of them said. "And what's this about you taking in that orphan girl? You don't know the first thing about raising a kid." "Guess I'll learn," Jack said. He worked from dawn until dark, felling trees and hauling logs, measuring and cutting and hammering. His hands blistered and his back screamed in protest, but he kept going. The cabin started to take shape, just one room for now, with a loft where Sarah could sleep. It wasn't much, but it was solid and well built, with a good fireplace and a window that looked out over the valley. On the last day of the month, when his employment at Henderson's ranch officially ended, Jack rode to the cabin and looked at what he had built. It wasn't finished. It needed furniture and a better roof and a dozen other things, but it was habitable. It was a home. He rode to the orphanage that afternoon and asked to speak with Mrs. Patterson and Sarah together. They met in the sitting room, Sarah looking confused and a little worried. Jack realized she probably thought he was saying goodbye. He knelt down in front of her so they were eye to eye. "Sarah, I need to ask you something important. I've built a house not far from here. It's not fancy, but it's solid and warm. I'm going to start homesteading, building a life there. And I was hoping—" He paused, suddenly nervous. "I was hoping you might want to come live there with me. I know I'm not your papa. I could never replace him. But I could take care of you. I could give you a home and a family, if you want that." Sarah stared at him with wide eyes. "You want me to live with you?" "Yes, I do. Very much. Forever. Forever." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't sad tears. She threw her arms around his neck and buried her face against his shoulder. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, please." Jack held her, feeling his own eyes burning. He looked over her head at Mrs. Patterson, who was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "I'll have the papers drawn up," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're a good man, Jack Mercer. That little girl is lucky to have you." Jack wanted to say that he was the lucky one, but he couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. So he just held Sarah and thought about the future stretching out before them, uncertain but full of possibility. They moved to the cabin the following week. Jack had managed to build 2 simple beds, a table, and chairs. Mrs. Patterson donated some dishes and blankets. Other people in town, once they heard what Jack was doing, showed up with contributions: a lamp, a cooking pot, some preserved food to get them through the first weeks. Jack was overwhelmed by the kindness. The first night in the cabin, Jack tucked Sarah into her bed in the loft. She looked so small under the quilt, her brown hair spread across the pillow. "You okay up here?" he asked. "It's perfect," Sarah said. Then, quietly, "Jack, can I ask you something?" "Anything? Why did you want me, Mrs. Z?" Patterson said lots of people come to the orphanage looking at children, but they always want babies or really little kids. Nobody wants the older ones, especially ones who are sad all the time. "Why did you want me?" Jack sat on the edge of the bed and thought about how to answer. "Do you remember the day I found you?" he asked. "When you were crying in the forest?" Sarah nodded. "I could have ridden past. I could have told myself it was just the wind or an animal and kept going. But something made me stop. Something made me get off my horse and go looking for you. And when I saw you sitting there, so scared and alone, I knew I couldn't just leave you. I knew I had to help you." He paused. "And then, after I brought you to Mrs. Patterson's, I couldn't stop thinking about you. I kept wondering if you were okay, if you were eating, if you were crying at night. I started visiting because I needed to know you were all right. And somewhere along the way, you became important to me. The most important thing in my life, actually. So I didn't really choose you, Sarah. I think maybe you chose me." Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm glad you stopped. I'm glad you didn't keep writing." "Me too, sweetheart, me too. Life on the homestead was hard." Jack worked the land every day, clearing more trees, planting crops, building fences. Sarah helped as much as she could, feeding the chickens Jack bought, tending the small vegetable garden they planted together, learning to cook simple meals. They were poor, there was no denying that. Some nights they ate nothing but beans and cornbread. Their clothes were patched and re-patched. Winter was brutal, with snow piling high and the cold seeping through every crack in the cabin walls. But they were happy. Sarah laughed more with each passing month. She made friends with children in town and attended the small schoolhouse. She learned to ride thunder and would gallop across the property with her hair flying behind her, free and wild. The nightmares that had plagued her at first became less frequent, then rare, then almost non-existent. Jack discovered that he was good at being a father. He was patient when Sarah struggled with her lessons, gentle when she had bad days, firm when she needed discipline. He taught her to fish in the stream and to track animals in the forest. He told her stories at bedtime and made her laugh with terrible jokes. And slowly, the emptiness that had defined his life for so long filled up with purpose and love. 5 years passed. The cabin was expanded with 2 more rooms. The crops grew better each season. Jack bought a milk cow and more chickens. They weren't wealthy, but they were no longer just surviving. They were thriving. Sarah grew from a frightened 6-year-old into a confident 11-year-old with opinions about everything and a smile that could light up a room. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sarah leaned against Jack's shoulder. "Papa," she said. She had started calling him that after the first year, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. "Yes, sweetheart." "I was thinking about Mama and Papa today. My first parents, I mean." Jack tensed slightly. Sarah rarely talked about them anymore. "What were you thinking?" "I was thinking about how Mama used to sing to me at night, and how Papa used to let me ride on his shoulders. I don't want to forget them." She looked up at him. "Is that okay? To remember them and still love you?" Jack felt his throat tighten. "Of course it's okay. They were your parents. They loved you, and they would want you to remember them. Loving them doesn't mean you can't love me too. The heart's got room for all kinds of love. I think they would like you," Sarah said thoughtfully. "I think they would be happy that you found me, that you didn't leave me alone in the forest. I think they would be proud of you," Jack said. "Look at how strong you've become, How brave. You've built a whole new life. We built it, Sarah corrected. Together, Jack agreed. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Jack thought about that day in the forest 5 years ago. He thought about the sound of crying that had made him stop, the terrified little girl he had found, the choice he had made to not just save her, but to build a life with her. It had been the hardest thing he had ever done. It had also been the best thing. He had spent his whole life before Sarah drifting without purpose, a man without roots or direction. The war had left him scarred and hollow. The years after had been filled with empty motion, working just to survive, living just to keep living. But that little girl crying in the forest had given him something he hadn't even known he needed. She had given him a reason to build instead of drift, a reason to plan for tomorrow instead of just enduring today, a reason to hope, and in return he had given her a home. Not just a physical structure, but a place where she was loved and safe and valued. A place where she could heal and grow and become whoever she wanted to be. They had saved each other, really. Two lost souls who found each other in the wilderness and decided to face the world together. The stars multiplied overhead, brilliant against the black sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Thunder nickered softly in the barn. Sarah yawned and stood up, stretching. "I'm going to bed," she announced. "We have to go to town tomorrow, remember? Mrs. Patterson wants me to help with the younger children." "I remember," Jack said. Sarah had started volunteering at the orphanage, reading to the little ones and helping them with their lessons. She said she wanted to help kids who felt as lost as she once had. Jack couldn't have been prouder. Sarah paused at the door and looked back at him. "Papa, thank you for what? For stopping, for listening, for not leaving me there." Jack stood and walked over to her, pulling her into a hug. "Thank you for letting me be your papa, for teaching me what matters, for giving me a family." They stood there for a moment, father and daughter, bound not by blood but by choice and love in the 1,000 small moments that had built their life together. Then Sarah kissed his cheek and went inside, leaving Jack alone with the night and his thoughts. He stayed on the porch a while longer, listening to the sounds of the forest and the distant creek, thinking about everything that had led him to this moment, all the pain and wandering and loss, all the choices, good and bad, all the roads taken and not taken. It had all led him here, to this rough-hewn cabin and this small piece of land and the girl sleeping peacefully inside. He had never been a man who believed in destiny or fate. Life had always seemed too random, too cruel for that. But standing there under the vast Montana sky, Jack thought that maybe some things were meant to be. Maybe that day in the forest, when Thunder's ears pricked forward at the sound of crying, when he chose to stop instead of riding on, maybe that had been the moment his real life began. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. Jack turned and went inside, closing the door gently behind him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new work, new moments to share with Sarah. But tonight, in this quiet cabin on the edge of the wilderness, everything was exactly as it should be. A little girl who had once wept alone in the forest now slept safely in her bed, surrounded by love, and a cowboy who had spent his life drifting had finally found his way home.